In 2007, San Francisco was experiencing a familiar problem. A major design conference had come to the city. Hotels were fully booked, and thousands of visitors were left searching for places to stay. At the exact same time, two young designers, Chesky and Gebbia, were facing a much smaller but deeply urgent problem. They couldn't afford their rent. Both had recently moved to the city. Both were trying to build careers in design, and neither had stable income. They noticed the hotels were sold out, and they had extra space in their apartment. So they bought a few air mattresses, set them up in their living room, and created a simple website offering short-term stays. They called it Air, Bed, and Breakfast. 3 people signed up. Those first guests paid to sleep on air mattresses in a stranger's apartment. But something unique happened. They shared the space, interacted with the hosts, and left with an experience that was profoundly different from a traditional hotel stay. At that point, there was zero indication this would become a global company. The idea felt temporary, unconventional. But for Chesky and Gebbia, that early result was enough. It proved that under the right conditions, people were willing to try something different. They brought in a third co-founder, Nathan Blatcharczyk, to handle the technical side. Now the concept had structure. The product was built. It was a website where hosts could list available space, guests could browse and book, and payments could be processed online. But the real challenge wasn't building the product, it was changing behavior. Travelers were used to hotels, hosts were not used to opening their homes, and this entirely new idea required both sides to trust a system that didn't yet exist. Growth was painfully slow. Outside of large events, demand was inconsistent and listings were limited. The platform struggled to gain traction beyond small pockets of early users. Because of this, Airbnb wasn't just unfunded, it was positioned entirely outside of what investors were used to backing. By 2008, the company was running out of money. Revenue was limited, investor interest was minimal, and the platform could not sustain itself. This is the exact moment where most early-stage companies fail, not because the idea is impossible, but because they run out of time. Instead of shutting down, they got creative. During the US presidential election, they designed and sold novelty cereal boxes, branded Obama O's and Cap'n McCain. They handled everything themselves: design, packaging, marketing, and distribution. It had absolutely nothing to do with their core idea, but it worked. They generated over $30,000 in revenue. It didn't solve their long-term challenges, but it extended their runway. More importantly, it showed they were willing to adapt, step outside conventional startup paths, and do whatever it took to keep the company alive. Later that year, they were accepted into Y Combinator. At the time, Airbnb was still not an obvious success. Growth was uneven, the concept was unconventional, and the potential was unclear. But within Y Combinator, a critical shift occurred. The focus moved from simply acquiring listings to improving the experience. The founders realized the single biggest barrier to growth was trust. Users needed to feel confident about where they were staying and who they were interacting with. So instead of scaling aggressively, they slowed down and focused on quality. They traveled to New York, met their early hosts directly, and took professional photos of the listings themselves. The impact was measurable. Better photos led to more bookings. More bookings created more trust, and that trust started to build momentum. What emerged wasn't explosive growth, but consistency. To scale this, Airbnb built trust directly into the system. They introduced reviews where guests could rate hosts and hosts could rate guests. Every interaction created a record, which over time formed reputations. Identity verification systems were introduced, and profiles became more detailed. It reduced uncertainty. Slowly, people who would never have considered staying in a stranger's home started to reconsider, not because the idea had changed, but because the system around it had.
By 2009 and 2010, usage became consistent. Demand surged in urban centers with high hotel prices and limited space, places like New York, San Francisco, and Paris. What was once an emergency solution for events was becoming a genuine alternative to traditional accommodation. Investors who had previously rejected the pitch began to take a second look. The pitch hadn't changed dramatically, but the data had. Bookings were increasing, retention was improving, and user behavior was stabilizing. The risk was now measurable. Airbnb was no longer just an idea, it was a functioning marketplace. Funding followed, a seed round in 2009 and a larger Series A in 2010. The founders were no longer trying to convince investors the idea could work, they were showing that it already was. But scaling a two-sided marketplace had to be managed carefully. Imbalance could break the system. Too many guests without enough hosts meant poor experiences, and too many hosts without enough demand reduced earnings. They leaned into what hotels couldn't replicate: local experience, apartments, spare rooms, entire homes. Each stay felt different, more personal, more affordable, and often more available. By the early 2010s, it crossed an important threshold. It was no longer a niche alternative, it was becoming part of how people traveled. But with growth came friction. Cities pushed back. Regulators questioned short-term rentals in residential areas. Hotels saw a direct threat. Legal battles erupted. Cities introduced restrictions, and some attempted outright bans. Scaling a product is one thing, but scaling within legal and political systems you don't control is where many companies struggle. Airbnb had to adapt. They began working with cities, introduced policies to support compliance, collected taxes in certain regions, and created frameworks for responsible hosting. By the mid-2010s, they were established globally, with millions of listings and hundreds of millions of bookings. Travelers no longer asked whether they should use it, they compared it directly with hotels. Every new host increased supply, and every new guest increased demand. These network effects made it incredibly difficult for new entrants to compete. Competitors could build similar platforms, but they couldn't replicate the trust layer, the volume of listings, or the global user base. What started as a fragile concept was now highly defensible. By 2019, Airbnb was preparing for a public offering. Revenue was growing, the brand was globally recognized, and going public seemed like the natural next step. And then, in early 2020, the entire travel industry stopped. The COVID-19 pandemic brought global movement to a halt. Flights were canceled, borders were closed, and cities went into lockdown. Demand collapsed almost overnight. Bookings dropped sharply, revenue declined, and uncertainty returned. The company faced a crisis not caused by a lack of product market fit, but by the sudden disappearance of its entire market. Their response required aggressive speed and discipline. They reduced costs aggressively, cut marketing spend, restructured operations, and made the difficult decision to lay off a significant portion of their workforce. These were survival decisions. But as lockdowns eased, a subtle shift occurred. People avoided crowded hotels and preferred private spaces. Longer stays replaced short trips. Airbnb's model suddenly aligned perfectly with this new behavior. Homes instead of hotels, remote work instead of fixed offices. The platform adapted quickly, highlighting longer-term stays and promoting remote-friendly listings. Growth returned. By the end of 2020, Airbnb went public. Despite global uncertainty, investor demand was strong, and the company reached a valuation of around $100 billion shortly after its IPO. But the valuation isn't the most important part of the story. What matters more is what the company became. Airbnb didn't just build a product, they built a marketplace. They turned unused space into economic opportunity, giving individuals the ability to participate in global travel markets. And they did all of this by solving one core problem: trust between strangers. They didn't start with a clear path to a $100 billion company. They started with a constraint. They needed to pay rent. Airbnb didn't replace hotels overnight. It entered where the system was weakest: high prices, limited availability, inflexibility, and solved for those gaps. The company investors once dismissed as unrealistic is now embedded in how millions of people travel, not because the idea was obvious, but because it was executed over time, with discipline, with adaptation, and with the willingness to survive long enough for the idea to work.